Hello, everyone. Hello, Josefine.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good, thank you. We'll start in 2 minutes. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Josephine, for your contributions.
Of course, I'm happy to be here. Would you like me to already share my screen?
Yeah. I'm already sharing now. I'll just do the intro and then I will give the stage to you so that you
Oh, okay. No worries. I'll be patient.
We're all excited for this, yeah. All right, thank you everyone for joining. This is Rehan Zaidan from GDG Gulf Lebanon, and we're welcoming our outstanding speaker, Josephine, who will share up with us about accessibility testing with Chrome DevTools. First, who we are. We are Google developer groups supported by Google, and in Lebanon we have two, GDG Gulf Lebanon, based in Beirut, GDG North Lebanon, based in Tripoli North. Our objective is organizing events and connecting developers and speakers and companies together so that they find opportunities that suits everyone and suits each of them. Here are some photos of our previous events. And we're proud to be here in Lebanon with more than 5,000 members in Lebanon on meetup.com and on the GDG platform. Today, we welcome Josephine, who is an accessibility engineer at Storyblok and a Google developer expert and a woman tech maker ambassador. We're grateful for Josephine's contributions with this talk for a very important topic, which technically this is the first year that we talk about accessibility in our chapter. And the main reason why we are talking about accessibility is because we are joining the AUB Breaking Barriers Hackathon, which is taking place on June 4 and 5. So I believe some of you are already participating there. So thank you for the AUB Innovation Park for organizing this hackathon and inviting us to join them. So before we start, let's talk a bit about what is accessibility and why it's important. So when you build an accessible application, you are building an application that is for everyone, including the people that may have some disabilities. And it's very important that you build an application that all the users, no matter who they are able to perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with applications. However, how to build accessible applications and how to test if your web application is accessible, I will leave the stage to Josephine to share with us her insights and her knowledge about this. Thank you again, Josephine, for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Let me quickly share my screen. This one. All right. You should be able to see my screen now.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, let's dive right in. So thank you so much. I was already introduced so nicely, so I'm not going to spend too much time. This is me. I have been working in accessibility for, well, a little bit over 5 years now. And for the last 3 years, I've been at Storyblok. Storyblok is a headless content management system. And currently I'm working on making the platform more accessible. And I'm also a GDE, and this is also how I ended up here. So I'm really happy to be able to join the call today. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what accessibility means, how you can make a case for it, because typically when you start with accessibility in your project or in your company, there are some questions and people are trying to understand, like, why is it important? And I want to talk a little bit about like how you can kind of sell it, quote unquote. And then we're going to look at what are the most common issues and how can you find them. And then we'll get to the most important bits, which is the testing in Chrome DevTools, right? And if there are any questions, you can talk to me in the end, or you can ask the questions in the end, but you can also find me on LinkedIn, or you can send me an email if you have any questions. Actually, this is not up to date because I removed myself from Twitter, but the other platforms, you're more than welcome to get in touch also if you don't want to speak up here on the call, right? So what does web accessibility mean? Web accessibility basically means that we're making the tools, the websites, the technologies, in a way that people with disability can use them and participate equally on the web. And it's about creating inclusive experiences and really lowering the threshold as much as possible. And we want to make sure that this is like, usually people look to the developers to implement this, or look to the designers, and we start pointing fingers. And it's really, really important to understand that this is really a shared responsibility. It's not so much about your role. There's something that anybody or everybody can contribute in a way. And so that's why it's really important that we all kind of think about it in our day-to-day and how we can improve here. And so when we talk about web accessibility, there are a bunch of abbreviations that usually come up. For example, the WCAG, which is kind of the web standard for accessibility, right? So it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There's new iterations of them ever so often. There are working groups within the W3C working on this and iterating like what is changing on the web and how can we accommodate the standards for that. And this also applies to accessibility. You can kind of think of it as the documentation for accessibility, if you will. There are 3 different levels. So AA is kind of the most commonly required one. A is a little bit less strict, so just like kind of the baseline. And then you have AAA, which is the strictest kind of rule. Usually this is required by public institutions or anything that is really required for the whole population, for example, in a country, or organizations that are working with people with disabilities, because those rules are a little bit stricter. And when you look at the documentation, you can always come back to 4 principles. You already noticed we like our acronyms or our abbreviations in accessibility. It's called the POUR principles. So in general, we want to make sure that our content is perceivable. I think I have a typo in there, I'm sorry. We want to make sure it's perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, right? And so robust is referring to, can I use it with different kinds of user agents? Can I also use, for example, assistive technology? Can I use my keyboard to operate a page? Perceivable is, for example, for visual content, I want to make sure if I have an image, do I have an alternative text in case somebody doesn't see the image or the image isn't loaded, for example. Operable means I can get around. Also, again, for example, with assistive tech. And understandable is not only referring to, like, do I understand the content, but also do I understand how to use the web interface itself. And so these are a little bit abstract, but if it helps you, you can always come back to these and think of like, what is this criterion for? And then you can think of like the POUR principles. So I my mouse. Here we go. So, and technically, we would kind of think that the increase of like modern technology makes everything a little bit easier and can reduce barriers, and partially that is true. But it can also create new barriers, right? So especially in the modern frameworks, like some of them are really good at supporting accessibility, while others, like we have lots of animation and super interactive, and gets very, very complex. And then maybe it is a little bit more difficult to make something or to reduce the barriers, and we rather introduce new ones, for example, right? So it's really important to leverage the power that we have as developers, as designers, to make sure that we're reducing the barriers where we can. In fact, the majority of the web pages online are currently not accessible. There's a report they're called WebAIM 1 Million. I also have the resources in the end if you're interested in the report. And you can find, they have an overview of the 1 million most popular web pages. They crawl them automatically and check for accessibility errors. And they found that 97 of those web pages have accessibility failures in one way or another, right? So it's quite a lot. And even though there are many good reasons to care about accessibility, right? And now we're kind of getting into, I assume you already care because you all made it here, but if you're talking to people, maybe you want to convince somebody to incorporate this in your project, maybe it's worthwhile thinking about, sorry, that's my cat. He needs some attention, sorry. So that there's many good reasons to think about, like, why do we want to incorporate accessibility? First of all, accessibility or access to information and communication technologies is a human right as defined by the United Nations, right? And rightfully so. We should all ideally have access to the information that's important to us and contribute and participate as equally as possible. And I think, like, from a moral standpoint, the conversation should end, right? This is the right thing to do. However, usually, unfortunately, that is not enough if you're working in a more commercial setting. And so how do you usually convince folks to spend resources and time on something? Usually, unfortunately, it's money. And then it helps to look at how many people are we excluding that could be paying customers, right? And in fact, that's over 15% of the global population that has some form of disabilities. And so that's just like a rough, like, ballpark statistic, because some of the data is self-reported, and so it's really difficult to gather global data, right? But and so if you're imagining as a company, this is potentially a lot of people that you're missing out on, and they could be spending money on your product, for example, right? And also, it's worth thinking about, for some people, it helps to think about there's different categories of disabilities and impairments. For example, you can have a permanent disability. You can also have a temporary or situational limitation, right? And for some people, it's easier to imagine maybe sometimes you're in a loud environment and you can't turn up the volume on your phone, or you can't hear. And then maybe captions can help you, for example. Or maybe you are in a library and you can't speak up, or you can't turn up your phone, or you have really bad internet connection. You're in the car and you have very limited ability to look at your phone, or you're holding a cat or a baby, or have a broken arm, right? So there's many situations in which web accessibility benefits us all. And sometimes it helps folks to be reminded of that when you're in a situation of selling accessibility, right? And accessibility is for people with disabilities, but in the end, it does benefit us all, which sometimes can help sell it in the end. Also, for example, there's a bunch of legislations regarding to accessibility. So in Norway, in the UK, in Canada, in the US, we've already had for some time, we've had some laws regarding accessibility. In the US, there were some quite public lawsuits also regarding accessibility. And now in the EU, we have the European Accessibility Act, which actually comes into effect really, really soon in exactly 1 month, actually, on June 28, 2025. There's a new law regarding accessibility and how it is implemented also in the private sector, in e-commerce, for example. And so that will be really interesting how companies react to the kind of pressure that maybe a law has if they didn't want to just comply because of like moral reasons, right? And so now we can have a closer look at how the Chrome DevTools can actually help you doing that. And just so that I don't have to switch back and forth, I screenshotted it or made some videos. But if anything is unclear, I'm also happy to observe a random website and we can do it live, right? But this is just so that it's a bit easier to follow. And the first thing we could do for accessibility purposes would be running a Lighthouse audit, right? So I'm sure many of you maybe have done this before. Lighthouse is built into the Chrome DevTools. You can run it in your DevTools, and then you can select different kinds of categories as well. So, and one of them could be accessibility, for example. And I had a video in here, but it's not loading. That's very unfortunate. But that's not a problem because I will tell you what it does. You see, and we'll really quickly run it on my employer's website. Actually, let me quickly run the Lighthouse for accessibility. We'll analyze the page load. It takes a minute to run, and then this is an automated test, right? So it will not catch all the issues. It will rather catch maybe 30 or 40% as a rough ballpark. These automated tests, they do get better, but it's still just an automated test, and it's never the same as testing manually, and we'll always have to test manually, right? And so what we see here now is we have a score of 96, which is very close to 100, and it kind of lets you believe that this page is almost fully accessible, right? And then I can have a look at what are some issues that it finds. It finds issues for the color contrast. We can have a closer look at the elements that are failing. I can also inspect the element directly, for example. Now I lost my Lighthouse score there, though. We can have a look and inspect these. I can learn more about why it's a problem and how I can potentially fix it. And so that's really good, right? That's one kind of issue. That's a very common issue. And we could also include, have a look at the things that it couldn't test, and where it's actually telling us, hey, you actually need to check manually if any of these things are going wrong, right? So for example, interactive controls are keyboard focusable, meaning if I go onto my page and I tap, you see like a little outline around this button. And that is the keyboard focus that I can see here, right? It's not super visible, so that's definitely something to think about. But I have a focus here, and it moves, so I actually know where we are. We also have to indicate our purpose and state on the interactive elements. So you can't just have an empty link, for example, that would give an error. You want a logical tab order. We got more into that, right? And so step by step, I can see all the things that I should be also checking manually, which I think is really, really good. It's a benefit of the Lighthouse accessibility test. And I can also see the things that I passed just out of curiosity, for example, right? So that's how you run the Lighthouse score. Just beware that there's a guy who works also in accessibility, and Manuel Matuzovic is his name. He wrote an article of how you can actually build the most inaccessible page, but still have a perfect Lighthouse score. And it's kind of his way of making a bit of a joke of people thinking 100% is an accessible page. It isn't necessarily, and you just have to be careful not to be fooled by these numbers, basically. Then there is more. So we can have a look now at the next thing, which is the accessibility pane in the DevTools. You have a whole little area in the DevTools that you can be using just for accessibility testing. For example, so it opens up this whole new pane, and then I have a look at, for example, the ARIA attributes. So ARIA attributes are accessible rich internet applications, another abbreviation. And basically, if you are, so we always want to make sure we convey meaning with semantic HTML, for example, or with the native ways of the web. But if that's not, in some cases, that's not possible. And that's when we can use ARIA labels, for example, as a means to communicate things for assistive tech or for accessibility purposes. And I can inspect these here in the accessibility pane. I can also, I was mentioning just a few minutes ago, the focus order that has to be logical, and I can use the DevTools and the accessibility pane also to show the full source order of an element. And then I can see, so are the elements in a logical order? Am I not skipping any element, for example? Did I not mess up the order? All the interactive elements should be in there. And I can visualize that really nicely with the source order viewer. I can even toggle a full accessibility tree. So I can select enable full accessibility tree in the accessibility pane. And then I can actually use the little button that looks like a little stick figure in the top right corner of the where I can see the DOM to toggle between the DOM and the accessibility tree. And when I did that, I only see the elements that are communicated, for example, to assistive tech or to a screen reader, right? So I can quickly show that in the browser as well. So we're on a page, sorry for the fast scrolling. We're on the page, and now I can toggle to the accessibility tree. You may notice a lot of things are disappearing. And then I can see I have a heading here, for example. It says here it's a link, which is a bit confusing because it looks like a button, right? This is something that could be criticized when doing an audit here, because we want the elements that look like a link also to be a link semantically and the other way around. So there's a bit of a mismatch here. And I can now go through all the elements and see what is actually ignored, for example, and what elements are communicated with assistive technology in the accessibility tree. And this way I can also get a first glimpse of how would maybe a screen reader or any assistive technology interpret my page without always having to turn on the screen reader and trying to figure it out with a screen reader, because that might also take some practice. And that's the accessibility tree. We can also inspect color contrast, for example. So color contrast is one of the issues that goes wrong the most in accessibility. It's one of the things that is in the report as well. And yeah, it's one of the most common issues. It's really important that we have at least AA standard, which is 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. And here in this example, for example, we passed. But this is something that goes wrong a lot, and you can hover on an element, inspect the colors, and you'll see whether or not the color contrast is met. So I can hover, and we see under accessibility in the bottom half, it says contrast, and then we have a contrast of 16.5, which is pretty good. All right, and I can actually even enable even more tools. So I have the CSS overview, and I can capture the CSS or potential for CSS improvements on my whole page. And then it will give me recommendations of what colors to use together, which colors combinations to avoid. and it kind of collects a snapshot of all the colors that I'm using on my page. So that's also really helpful for you to figure out how to fix any color contrast issues that may come up. We can also use the rendering functionality in the DevTools to emulate different kinds of visual deficiencies. So we can, the default version is no emulation, but you can, for example, emulate blurred vision, reduced contrast, red-green color blindness, and so on, right? So I could, for example, emulate blurred vision. There we see that you need a really clear structure on your page to actually be able to make out what to do. We can reduce the contrast, and then we already have a hard time seeing where the search bar is, for example, right? And then I can simulate different kinds of visual impairments. This is full color blindness, for example. And these simulations, they only ever give a glimpse of it's just the first estimate of what the experience could be like, but it's worth thinking about and just trying to figure out if the color combinations you're using, for example, are working for people. You can also turn off or emulate if somebody is preferring reduced motion settings for animations, for example, to see if your animations would also work well if users have that setting turned on. And so if you've done all that, it's worth investigating the things that cannot be tested with the DevTools directly or automatically, right? And so that would be, for example, checking the tab order like we already discussed, but also checking if I have visual focus everywhere. Sometimes you lose focus, and then it's a good idea to try document active element to see where is the focus at when you lost it. And also make sure you're not trapping your keyboard users anywhere, so that they can actually get away anywhere. If they navigate there by keyboard, they also have to be able to get away again. You can try testing with screen readers. So if you're, for example, using a MacBook, you have VoiceOver already built in. On a Chromebook, it would be Chromebox. And you can test it for VoiceOver. There's also a little tutorial on your Mac, so you can kind of try and figure out how does a screen reader work, for example, and see what information is communicated. This might take some practice, but it's good to know how people are using this technology and how your page or the project that you're building maybe there's potential to improve that as well. And then you can inspect the different kinds of elements. Earlier I was mentioning we have the button, or no, it looks like a button, but it is a link. That's a bit of a problem. So that would be something I can inspect. Am I using the correct blend marks? Where am I using ARIA labels and why? So these are all things I could have a look at if I wanted to test even more in depth, right? So that was already all from my side. If you scan the QR code or you go to linktree/JosephineSCH, you will find some of the resources I was mentioning, some tools you can use for accessibility testing. I have a written summary of the talk as well if you want to follow up on that. And now would be time for questions if you have any. I take silence as no questions, but let me quickly check the screen.
Thank you, Josephine. First, thank you a lot for this insightful talk. To be honest, for myself personally, this is the first time that I learned about DevTools and for accessibility. So it's really an important topic and insightful. It was really clear. Thank you again for this talk. Yeah, I believe we have a question from Ali. Yes, please, Ali, go ahead.
Yep. Hi, Josephine. Thank you so much for the great talk. I just wanted to ask you about, from your experience, documentation with EAA, because I found it a bit unclear, like
Yes.
documentation process for the compliance, please.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's really unclear. So because the EAA is a European law or mandate, each member state of the EU interprets it a little bit differently, right? So I'm based in Germany. Here we have a national law that puts the EAA into effect. And this law, again, is like, I'm not a lawyer, right? So I have a hard time even reading it in my native language. And so then you have to figure out, okay, what rules apply to me, and how do I, like, which national law do I have to comply with, and where can I find like proper explanations of it? For the most part, if you are working with the WCAG, you will already cover a lot of so it's kind of like an extension of that, right? So your safest bet would be to stick as closely as you can to the WCAG, and then check what other rules are part of the national law for the EU member state that I want to comply with. Does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
But I 100% agree. It's really confusing and really complicated. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so take everything I say about the law with a grain of salt.
Thank you, Josefine. We have another question from Saya. It is in the Q&A. I will read it here. Hey, thank you so much. Quick questions. When you mention accessibility compliance, does that include mobile applications as well, or is it just for web? I have been wondering, since mobile has its own set of challenges, and I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So to be honest, I have to say I'm not 100% sure. I think it depends a little bit on the industry as well, because if you look at the EAA, it specifically talks, for example, about like communication services and messaging, and there I would imagine that this would cover like the most popular messaging apps as well, but I don't actually know for sure how this is documented in the law. And for sure, like in terms of accessibility, there are very different challenges for mobile, absolutely. And I'm not a mobile developer, so I can't speak to that to a bigger extent. So I will also do my research, and if I find something, I'll share it after. That's a really, really good point. Yeah. Sorry, I can't speak more to that.
Anyways, this is clear. Thank you. Thank you, Josephine. Anyone, does anyone have any other questions? Okay, so I myself have a question. So just being you're an accessibility engineer, can you please tell us how about your journey? How did you become an accessibility engineer? Is like there was like specific courses that you take, or is it like a university degree, or how was your journey as you became an accessibility engineer?
Yeah, I studied something completely different. I worked in a different field. Then I did a programming boot camp and became a front-end engineer. I worked in that field for a little bit. And so I have switched around a lot, but ever since I became a front-end engineer, I was interested in the topic, and I was lucky enough to be on projects where there was also mentorship and there was a need for accessibility. And so I dug deeper and deeper and deeper into it, and it just became kind of my passion and something I wanted to incorporate in any project that I was doing. And now last year I did a certification. It's called CPACC, and this is kind of the most official one that I know for accessibility. I don't know of any others, but that doesn't mean there aren't any. I'm sure there are other good ones out there. That's the one that I took. It's called like Certified Accessibility Professional. And yeah, so it's most people get in kind of through different ways, and it's not like one standard path.
Okay, thank you so much. This is really exciting. We have another question from Bias. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for this session. I joined late, sorry, but I want to ask, I don't know if you mentioned it in the workshop before, but I would like to know, how do you include accessibility testing in the QA process, and how do you report and prioritize the accessibility bugs?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and definitely an area of learning, right? It really depends on the project that you're working on. And how many resources can be dedicated to accessibility in terms of like how it's prioritized. So what we are trying to do is in the company where I work right now is that we incorporate it also automatically in the testing tool. So we have accessibility linting that we're introducing so that the devs already notice like early on. And we want to enforce this. We are not doing that yet, but we want to enforce it so that you can't even push code that has automated accessibility failures, so to say. And then the next step from there would be to have like also tests running maybe in the pipelines to make sure that you can't deploy anything that has accessibility failures. And then our QA team has been doing a massive effort of using Playwright for accessibility testing, so writing automated tests with Playwright. Right. And then they're also doing manual testing. And we try to write like very clear, like what is expected, what are the best practices, and we try to test with screen readers, for example, as well. But that's by no means a complete list. There's more for sure, but that can be done. But that's how we started, because you have to start somewhere, right? And everybody's really busy. So
thank you so much.
It's a really good question, though. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Any other questions? I really encourage you to just share your thoughts. If you're not able to open the mic, please write your questions in the chat.
And also, if questions come up later, no problem. You can always get in touch on LinkedIn, for example, or just write an email.
Okay, I reshared again Josefine LinkedIn on the chat. So please feel free to reach out to her if you have any other questions later on. I will leave it here if no one else has any other questions. Thank you again, Josefine. Thank you everyone for joining and for learning and advocating for accessibility, and hopefully more people consider accessibility in their websites and our community. And in developing the applications and projects and solutions. Thank you again, Josefine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.